You are.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Nope.
No.
అన్న నువ్వు వీడియో ఆఫ్ చేసేసుకోవచ్చు. యప్ అమ్మాయి కూడా.
Can you see my screen now?
Now yes.
Okay. Okay. And I'm audible, Kada Praveen?
Yes,
Just
yes.
I cannot see anything except my screen now, so I'm just double checking. Okay. Okay. Jai Baba to the full Eruvuro family. And today I'm going to talk about ego. Last year, maybe at least, I don't know, 5, 6 months ago, I had spoken about the first chapter of ego. But today, the intention is to just take what Meher Baba talks about ego in discourses, and some part of it might be slight repetition, although I'm not going into as much detail, but it is covering 3 chapters in discourses into this presentation. Yeah. It's very interesting. If we look at the situation, we know half our families in the US, and if we really look at what is happening in the US right now with Donald Trump, the attack on the Capitol, the absolute disruption that is happening in the US. A lot of that revolves around ego, not being able to take defeat, accept defeat, and going to any extent, to be able to prove that I'm a winner and so on. That's one form of an ego. And maybe if we have time later, I'll talk about an analogy, if we have time, about US and ego and discourses, and what a great similarity the discourses has when you compare that to what is happening in the US. But when you keep that aside as well, ego is a very often used word in our day-to-day vocabulary. There are a lot of terms and words that we hear: desires, sanskaras, consciousness, that comes, in discourses and in God Speaks. But ego is a word which is used by us in day-to-day language, and we see it in our existence, in our homes, in our offices, in our communities, with our friends. It is in play. Yeah. Anybody who says I don't have an ego is quite very likely to be wrong, because ego is like us breathing. It's that integral to human existence. So I'll try to simplify it and explain it as much as I can, as much as I have understood. Maybe some things I have not myself understood, and then we'll open it up for a discussion after this. So before I get into the topic of ego, I want to again take a step back, and this is for all of us to really understand there's God Speaks and there's discourses. And I remember hearing another presentation where very nicely they explained God Speaks is like a design manual, Anmata. It's like a design specifications manual. It explains why, where, what, who. How did this whole universe, how did this whole consciousness come into existence? There's a lot of conversations around that space. So it's like a design specification manual. And discourses is more like an operations manual. How do I take Baba's teachings and apply it and use it in my day-to-day life operationally? Right? Doesn't matter how we came into existence, all that aside, how do I take these teachings and apply it in the context of everyday life? So there are different topics that are there in the discourses, and ego is one such topic that is covered across 3 chapters in the discourses. Now, again, I'd spoken a little more detail in my previous session, so I'm not going to be getting into detail, but I think all of us really already understand that ego is I consciousness. That every time when we say I like mango pudding, I love to watch Bollywood movies, I am a person who hates hypocritical people, I am a very charitable person. I in each of these sentences represents ego. Yeah? And this is coming in from the discourses itself. The human consciousness would be nothing more than a repository for the accumulated imprints of varied experiences, or sanskaras, if it did not also contain the principle of ego-centered integration, which expresses itself in the attempt to organize and understand experience. This is a very complicated sentence. When I first read it, I did not understand it, quite frankly. But if I have to very simply put it, and I'll talk about that in my subsequent slide, ego gets into the system when the consciousness evolves into humans. Okay, this is important for all of us to understand. Animals do not have an ego. If you have a dog, it does not have an ego. Okay, humans have an ego, and it is at the center of our consciousness. It is important in a way. It is also derogatory. We all talk of ego in a negative sense. He's a very egoistic fellow. He's a very egoistic thing. I started this topic when I spoke of Donald Trump and the US in a derogatory way, in a negative way. But when you really get into the discourses and what Baba talks about ego, there is a necessity for ego. There is a need for the ego as well in our day-to-day existence. So ego is at the center of our consciousness. Okay, and I'll explain a little bit more of what that means. Let's take a step back and try and understand this a little more, right? So the soul, right? We all know Baba says that the stone also has a soul, metal also has a soul, insect, birds, trees, animals, and humans. All of these different forms of consciousness has a soul. And the soul goes through various forms of consciousness. Eventually, from the stone, through several births and deaths and several progresses through different levels of consciousness, it goes from transitions from a stone to a human consciousness. Okay, sorry. Now, once we become a human, right, we have three types of bodies within us: mental body, subtle body, and gross body. And the mental body is contains all the sanskaras. Okay, I like to eat mango is a sanskara. Every time I see a mango, I cannot resist myself. Something in me has always attracted me to mangoes, and I eat 4 mangoes in a row, and that is what satisfies me. Some other person looks at a mango, might not even be interested in the mango. I'm giving a very basic example of sanskaras. Everything that we do creates sanskaras. And Ravi Mai, I think, if I remember correctly, has already done a session on sanskaras. So sanskaras are karmic impressions. A combination of these sanskaras creates tendencies. Some people have the tendency to get angry very easily. Some other people tend to have the tendency of being fearful very easily, right? It's a combination of these different sanskaras that creates tendencies. All these things reside in what we call a mental body. Within the subtle body resides ego and desires. This is in the human consciousness again, okay? It's not in an animal. When a dog is eating a bone and you go near that dog, the dog grrr and it growls, right? It's getting angry at that time, but that's it. It does not hold that anger. A dog also has sanskaras, but it does not have an ego. It is a mechanical, automatic, instinctive response that a dog gives when its territory is being challenged, but it's not based on an ego problem. Okay, so you have to understand the distinction. So we all have an ego and desires. Okay, the ego takes the sanskaras or a group of sanskaras that we have, right, applies some sort of a synthesis or a intelligence on those sanskaras, right? It's always looking for certain desires. So sanskaras applied with the ego, used upon the desires that we have, creates emotions, right? Behaviors, and ultimately action, right? So it creates an action. So when if somebody has come and spoken a little rudely to me, not directly, indirectly, I have certain impressions within me saying that somehow everybody is very rude to me. People are always rude to me. They're trying to attack me, and samskaras, impressions are there, or tendencies are there in myself. My ego is saying, how dare that fellow is rude to me. It has happened in front of 3 other people. I have a desire not to lose my paru, right? Lose face in front of other people. And that creates a behavior or an emotion of anger or defensiveness inside myself, and then I give it back to that person, give back a strong response to that person, and insult that person again. So this is one cycle and mata. In that process, further sanskaras get created. So this is the vicious cycle that we are in. Okay, so we have sanskaras constantly generate. We are a production house of sanskaras. We have the ego that, when applied on these groups of sanskaras, right, and then combined with our desires, creates action that is then creating even more sanskaras. Okay. So when you go to the discourses on ego, basically there are three parts. Part number one talks about the origin of ego and the key characteristics of ego. Part two talks about essentially the main characteristics of ego is the separateness. Okay, and I'll talk about that. Okay, that's part two. And part three is the different forms of ego and their dissolution. How do we reduce and get rid of this ego and mata? I'll take a quick pause. Praveen, am I doing okay in terms of speed and time?
Yeah, Kiran. Pawan.
Okay.
Yeah. It's only, yeah, go ahead.
It's clear, right? Everything is audio is clear.
Are you through most of it, or are you 50% done?
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know.
Okay.
40% maybe.
Good. Okay.
Okay, 30-40%. Okay. So let's go to the part one, okay, of this discourses. I spoke about it. Ego is I consciousness and comes into play in the human consciousness. Okay. In fact, ego is at the center of human consciousness. It is the reference point. Whatever we do, it goes back to the reference point at the center of whatever we do is I. That is what we mean by ego is at the center of human consciousness. Ego always associates itself with I and the body and mata. Okay, we have a soul and we have a body. Ego always associates itself with I and body related pleasures, bodily related needs, okay, which are more materialistic, which are more superficial. Ego is a necessary evil. Okay, and I was surprised to hear actually there are benefits of ego. I wasn't able to understand this, so I had to really try to understand this better, even in the discourses or not. That's why I put it in red font. We'll talk a little bit more about it. Fundamentally, ego is separatist in nature. The ego's quality is I am separate, you are separate. I am different, you are different. The nature of the soul inside us is always trying to get back in connection with the rest of the souls. Right? Baba says that all the souls are the same. And we are all part of that Paramatma, all Atmas. So we are all connected. We are all the same in terms of, when you look at it from a soul perspective. The soul's inherent need is to get connected to another soul. Okay, the ego fundamentally is opposing in nature. It separates you from other consciousnesses or souls. That is the inherent nature of ego. And therefore, ego creates fundamental conflicts. Okay, because the need of the body and the need of the soul are fundamentally different. Need of the body is wealth. I want more money. I want that new car. I want to go to that new place for a vacation. I want to buy a new house. I should be better than this person. I should be number one in whatever I do. I should never lose, be humiliated in front of people. This is the need of the body, which is the chief commander of this body is the ego. Okay, think of it as the president of this union called the body. Okay. But the soul, which is the purest form, our internal, is essentially longing to do exactly the opposite. The soul is always trying to go towards the spiritual needs in life. It inherently understands the uselessness of all these other things, and it is moving towards the spiritual thing. And that is why there is always a conflict that every human being goes through, because no matter how much we go through getting these material needs, there is a gap between what the soul requires and what the body needs, and therefore we don't even understand it on many occasions. Nagbuddha, I got this as an insight when I was reading the discourses. There is that feeling of emptiness or a gap that we have in our lives, no matter what. And the richest people who seem to have achieved a lot, they have some emptiness or a gap. Poorest people, they also have that gap. And that fundamentally is because of the conflict that is created by the ego. It is moving us in a direction that is opposing to where the soul wants to go. Okay. And because of this, because the ego is constantly moving, what Baba says is firm decisions need to be made to follow the right values. I'll talk a little bit more about this soon. And ultimately, what Baba says is the disintegration of the ego, right? Removing the ego culminates, or we can conclude that by removing the ego, ultimate truth is achieved. Aham understands that Aham Brahmasmi. Okay. So these are the salient points of part 1. I want to spend a little bit time of ego is a necessary evil. I was not able to understand why is ego necessary, right? See, there are different types of ego. Ippudu intlo unnanu, somebody comes and tells something to Ahan, scolds him just like that. Neighbor comes and does that, goes. You think I'll stay quiet? I'll say, how the hell are you talking to him like this? Please get out of this house. It's called a family ego. We need this family ego because at the end of the day, I have a responsibility. All of us have a responsibility to take care of our family, to protect our family. There is a need to have this ego, right? So that's called a family ego. Okay. There is a national ego. When we were under the British rule, suppressed, repressed by them, there was a need for the people to come together, right, as one force to fight against the British, right? So this was the need. So there was a national ego. So there was a benefit of having that level of ego, saying that I cannot let that guy suppress me. But Britishers also were human beings, right? If you go by Baba's teachings, they were also human beings. They are also going through their sanskaric cycles, right? We can just let them come and rule India, right? Nothing wrong with that, right? But there was a need of the hour to come together and fight them. Kapus, caste system, right? If I have a neighbor and I come to know Manodera, Kapu, right? In Singapore, he's come and settled. Then they are settling down in the house. I will take lunch dabba, say, don't worry, Andy, we'll prepare lunch dinners for you next 2-3 days. You settle down, okay? There is a benefit of that, right? There is an inherent benefit of, even though I'm restricting it, that ego is helping me be generous to that person. So there is some sort of a benefit of that. So where is the problem? The problem really is that when one big problem, I'll talk about the problems later, but if you take these 3 examples, it is a relevant need, ego, but it is still restrictive. It does not encompass everybody in this existence, because all human consciousness, whether you're British, American, West Indian, South African, Indian, Kapu, Kamma, Reddis, the souls are the same. So it's like a knife, right? We can use the knife to our use, to our benefit, or it can be used to murder somebody. Crutches. Let's say I've injured. Prasanna, I've come to you and I've injured my hip and you give me crutches. I need those crutches to walk. But if I'm continuously dependent on these crutches, I will never learn to be independent of those crutches, if you understand what I'm saying. So as long as I'm healing my hip, the crutches are a need for me. It is necessary, but it becomes an evil when my dependency on those crutches becomes a lot. In the discourses, Baba talks about this as well. When a driver is in a car, you're pressing the accelerator button or the brakes button, I'm saying the pedaling, yeah, the pedal. They are needed, right, to move the car from A to B. But you still need a GPS to guide you in the right direction. So think of the accelerator and the brake as the ego. You still need those, right? At least until you reach your final destination. Once you reach your final destination, then you don't need the accelerator because you already arrived, right? Think of that as nirvana. Think of that as God realization. But you need a GPS, right? Or a perfect master to guide you through this in the right direction. So this is the concept of ego is a necessary evil. So let's not always look down upon ego. We need to accept that all of us have an ego. We need to accept that there is a certain shelf life to this ego, which is relevant to all of us. But we need to get into a position where we leverage the ego and the ego is not using us. Okay. Ego is separatist in nature. What does that mean? That actually takes us to part 2, okay, of this chapter. So when you look at it, there are 2 or 3 points in part 2 of discourses predominantly, right? 2 or 3 key concepts in part 2 of discourses. First is there are 2 characteristics of ego: separateness and differentiatedness. Let me explain this concept. Separateness, I already spoke to you about this, and I spoke about this example in my previous session, so I'll go a little faster on this. But it is me, whenever there is separateness, I'll give an example. Praveen, Prasanna, when they were in Vijayawada, there was a situation where, okay, Kapus, Kammas, Reddis, we think of each other as different people, and there is a separateness amongst these different castes. I'm not saying Prasanna, you and Praveen were doing this, but there is a caste feeling. So we say, Kapu people are very good. These Kammalu, these people they are generally greedy, whatever, right? There might be these different kinds. Vice versa, right? The caste feeling. Then Praveen and Prasanna went to Manipal. When they went to Manipal, they said, wow, okay, I mean, I don't have luxury of only Kapus, but I have Telugu people over here. Then it became a different boundary over here. Okay, mana Telugu, okay, it doesn't matter which caste. Better than these people from Udupi, or better than from Trivandrum. Then there's a north-south divide. Oh, we are South Indians, North Indians. And then you have Indians versus Malaysians. You see? So the concept of separateness comes from ego. It unites people together, but there's a limitation to that. Unites Kapus together, that's a certain type of an ego, but then it restricts you to be able to scale to the entire universe. So there's these apples over here, this example I gave. All these apples seem to be a part of the same basket. They all feel as one. This is what we were, all the souls were a part of the Paramatma, right? We were all a part of that one, okay? Then you take 2 out of those 2 apples from those baskets and put it together separately. These 2 apples will say, we are together. We are together. All those other apples are separate. We both are together. There is still a certain feeling of togetherness. You cut that apple and you take the seeds out. Now you ask the seed, are you a part of the apple? It says, no, look at me, look at that. In fact, I create more apples. Look at that apple, that's useless. People eat it, it's gone. Weak. I'm strong. I can create, I can grow into more apples. I'm a seed. This apple says, look at that seed, tasteless. Look at me, sweet and juicy. So the identities got created separately. This is called differentiatedness. Okay, if you take the previous part, 2 apples, they say we are together, but I am a separate apple A, you are apple B. That's a separateness. We are different from each other. Differentiatedness is to be able to then say, compare with other people and then create either a sense of inferiority complex or superiority complex. Okay. This is what Baba talks about. These are the different forms of ego, actually, types of ego. Okay, either you feel lesser than somebody or you feel superior to somebody else, and then that creates trigger points to have certain emotions, which then triggers off certain behaviors. And the ego itself, through separateness, affirms this separateness through craving, hate, anger, fear, and jealousy. I'm rich, I'm poor, you are rich. When I look at it, creates a certain sense of jealousy. If I all feel a sense of unity, we're all in this together. His wallet has 0 money. He's a very poor boy, technically, in quotes. But because he's a part of my consciousness, I don't see a separateness between Ahan and myself. I genuinely feel my money is his money. I don't look at him as poor or rich. I look at him as a part of me, just to give an example, right? But when we look at ourselves as separate, then it creates these things of hate, anger, fear, jealousy, and so on. Okay. An interesting insight I got reading through the discourses is that consciousness expands and contracts. The obvious this is my interpretation, okay, which takes me to this. When you take ego, when you have 3 different souls, soul 1, soul 2, and soul 3, in the context of ego, if you look at the dotted squares around the souls, it's the consciousness. We always feel as a separate consciousness from the other soul. And so ego always inherently breeds exclusiveness. So if there's one thing I want you all to leave, if you don't forget about every other point, it is this characteristic. And when we identify that, that is when it creates these problems. Okay, it always makes you separate, it makes you exclusive from the rest, and that causes craving, hate, anger, fear, and jealousy. Love, on the other hand, it extends. Your consciousness is like a rubber band and matter. When we like somebody, our consciousness goes and surrounds that other soul. That's why we feel like one. There is a vibe, there is an energy. We feel together. Love, on the other hand, is inclusive by nature. And once that's what you take the example of, I'm sorry, I keep taking Donald Trump's example. It's a very negative example, but after those riots happened in the Capitol, his first video, he says, I love you. And you're good people, patriots, whatever, right? I don't remember the exact. In that, it may be right or wrong is a separate story, but his thinking, his consciousness extends to that group of people. Even if they are doing something wrong, he extends a sense of love for that group of people who are aligned with him. And therefore, his consciousness has extended to what they were doing. And that creates love, control over your emotions, compassion, humor towards life, good or bad things happening. There's a certain humor, affection, and so on. One thing is very important for all of us to understand. Ego is very, very sticky, and it is self-perpetuating, and it creates more and more and more. It thrives on desires. And it's a lose-lose scenario on matter. I don't mean to sound negative, but that's what it is. When the desires are fulfilled, ego is very happy, leads to more desires. When the desires are not fulfilled, ego is unhappy, it starts thinking of doing anything else to meet those desires furthermore. So you see, it's self-perpetuating, it's a vicious cycle. It is unending in a manner. There is, there's no opening, it feels like, okay? Leading us to the third part of discourses, which talks about how do you dissolve. I spoke about forms of ego in the previous section, which Baba talks about. Inferiority complex, superiority complex, equality. Sometimes equality also, we are saying, oh, I am equal to that person, is also one form of inferiority or a superiority complex. What Baba talks about as an end goal is unity, not equality, unity. We are one. We are not the same. We are not equal. We are one. That is in the context of forms of ego. But let's talk about dissolution of ego. Before we get into solutions, we have to understand what are the three key problems of ego that Baba talks about. And I've spoken about this in different forms already, so I will go through it quickly in the interest of time. There is a separatist nature, which is not a permanent solution. Okay, a Kapu neighbor I've got, I give him food for a day or 2 days. But what if some other caste? What if a German comes next to me? So it's not scalable because of this separatist attitude. All right. And that creates problems eventually. The second big problem of ego is the conflict that we spoke about. I don't know about all of you. For me, 100% I feel no matter how much of success, no matter how next target that I achieve, no matter how many years I've been getting what I think I want to get or achieve in my life, that emptiness continues to be there. That lack of fulfillment continues to be there for me. And yet, a simple task of living in the present and spending time with somebody, doing something good with absolutely no selfishness, with selflessness, it just gives at least 10 seconds of fulfillment and a complete feeling, and a momentary completeness feeling is there. So it creates this conflict because the soul is moving towards togetherness and the ego is always pushing you away from that direction. And the last problem of ego is ego always takes you towards false values. Wealth, drama, gain, self-importance, these kind of things. The solutions is love. When we are replacing some of these egoistic issues with love, right, then it dissolves ego. It's not easy. I can't. I don't like somebody and I can't suddenly say I love you and love you 10 times chepna kuda, it cannot change to love, right? But what Baba says is 100% when ego gets diluted, it gets automatically replaced with love. Okay. Baba also says that the big mantra for egos is desires and matter. Okay, it's desires. Ego thrives on desires. So when you give up desires, you are moving in the direction of reducing your ego. I have a piece of cake in my plate. I really feel like eating it. My relative or my cousin or my mother or my son or whoever I know, my brother asks for that piece of cake. Even though I feel like eating it, right? I just give it because my consciousness is surrounding together. There is love. But ever some Tom, Dick, and Harry comes in, I can see from the corner of my eye that he's eyeing my cake. I'll eat it a little faster so that there's no chance of me needing to give that cake, right? So giving up that desires, forcefully taking actions to become more and more selfless also leads to the reduction of the ego. Okay, that's the second solution. Following the right values, if you want to get an idea of right values, I think if you go through my wish, if you go through how to love God, if you go through the repentance prayer, it gives us already a great idea of the right values. Doing the right thing. Okay, my interpretation of this, what from Baba's discourses, the discourses, is that Baba is saying focus on what is right or wrong, don't focus on people. If you think about ego, it's usually associated with people or a group of people. But when you remove the focus from people and focus on doing what is right and not doing what is wrong, then automatically your ego is getting diminished or not. Okay, so that's the thing. But the reality is that this ego is complex, sticky, and self-perpetuating. This is in Baba's own words. Okay. Let us say I decide to be humble. This is such a big villain, this egoism. Or let us say that's the right value. I want to be humble. I become humble. I work hard. I do great things and I keep dedicating that to Baba. I say, Baba, you are the person. I'm not the person. Please help me. You work towards humble. Ego is such a bloody crook. I'm sorry for that word, but it's such a crook that it will still make you proud about being humble. It will create an ego about how humble you are. That is how sticky ego is. And that is why Baba says, and therefore, to really move towards the direction of eliminating ego, there is a need for a perfect master. All of us have access to it, whether we are a Baba lover or not a Baba lover. A perfect master could be an inspiration, a guide, a conscience, however you want to call it. But we need that perfect master to hold us, to guide us, and to take us through, this whole process. And for those people who question, right? ఇప్పుడు నాకు sugar problem ఉంది, or I know that currently I have a shoulder problem, okay, a tendon issue. I go to Prasanna. I know the problem that I have. Take the comparison as I have an ego problem. Okay, I know I have this problem. I know my shoulder is injured, but I am not the expert. I can do a few things, but I need to go to Dr. Rokkam Prasanna, to Meher Nursing Home, Meher Polyclinics, to get treated. And first time I go to him, reality is I will ask a few people, how is this doctor? I've heard Dr. Prasanna. Some people, he's a pretty good doctor. Okay, I'll read on Google, maybe I get some information. But reality is, how much ever I intellectualize that, it's not going to help me. Maybe he's wrong. Maybe he's got a false degree. I have 10,000 questions. There's no ways to prove yes or no. There is a leap of faith when I go to the clinic of Dr. Prasanna. And at some point in time when I'm in that clinic, I surrender to the doctor to take care of my shoulder issue. Because I really don't know what medicines he's giving me, what injections he's giving me, what his anesthesia is giving me. I don't know, right? When I go to a petrol pump, I have to believe somewhere. I take a leap of faith that when I put that thing into my gas tank, petrol is going in and not water. There is a leap of faith. And therefore, my strong request and recommendation would be that leap of faith is needed. Okay, I am convinced, I say that with a sense of conviction, for this perfect master to, over a period of time, over several lives, remove this particular ego. I conclude with Baba's saying, suffering is essential for the elimination of the ego. just as it was necessary for you to scrub and scrub in order to wash the stain for my cloth. What Baba says also in the discourses is that when a person goes and holds on to the daman of a perfect master, when things are going very well for him and he's feeling a little superior, he'll be brought down. And vice versa. When you're feeling really down and think something will happen where you get some confidence, you get a little more confidence on yourself. Things go up and down. That is indeed suffering. That is indeed scrub, scrub, scrub to ultimately wash the stain from the coat. Finally, I would like to say Jai Baba. Thank you. Jai Baba.